Hi, Sachsenhausen. Kolonia Gwarna, Parna, Germania richtig dicker Heil. Sachsenhausen. Wiertycie jak bambusik, trupie łebki to kaktusy heil. Es lebe kule to Kampf.
Welcome to Descendent Stuff, a podcast by and for the descendants of Sachsenhausen prisoners, working together to uncover the unanswered questions of its history. Sachsenhausen was a Nazi concentration camp located in Oranienburg, Germany, used from 1936 through April 1945. It was used as a labor camp, with a network of subcamps and worksites around the region, as well as a prison camp, death camp, medical experimentation center, and SS training ground. It was also the administrative center for all Nazi concentration camps. We are Jakob, Kelsey, and Nicole, 3 descendants of Sachsenhausen prisoners. Though our relatives were imprisoned for different reasons, we've discovered we have much in common. In each episode, we interview other descendants, researchers, and even survivors, sharing stories, memories, and research to build a clearer picture of the past, one that goes beyond the records. Through these conversations, we honor those who suffered and died at Sachsenhausen and strengthen our collective understanding of our own ancestors' experiences. We are here at the 81st commemoration of the liberation of Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Our entire podcast team is here in Tower A with Dr. Astrid Ley. We really appreciate spending some time with us today, talking with us. I think that you've been an instrumental part in all of our work, so it's really excellent to have you here. Thank you for taking time.
Thank you for the invitation.
So I think we want to start off with some questions about the history of the camp and some very specifics.
We are 5 descendants who are presenting their stories in the new exhibition, and we have one thing in common. All our ancestors have been there in the early times of the camp, mostly starting with Aktion Arbeitsscheureich. Some of us know a little bit how the life used to be for our ancestors in campsite. Some don't know anything. So I would like to ask you a couple of questions about life and how it was in those days.
Compared to later, the life in 1938 was relatively better to what prisoners later in the 1943, 1944, even 1945. Actually, the war, when Germans started the war, this was like a cut. This worsened life conditions a lot already. And from then on, it was one direction. But what we have to keep in mind is that your ancestors, both whether they were either prisoners of the so-called June campaign or prisoners of the November campaign, they belonged to a prisoners group which was low in the SS-made camp hierarchy. The SS was having a camp hierarchy among the prisoners, which is kind of mirroring the SS's racist worldview. In the time of 1938, when we do only have prisoners of German nationality, there was already a camp hierarchy, and on the top were the prisoners groups, political prisoners and so-called criminal prisoners, both the same, because the SS liked or disliked them both the same, but still within this SS hierarchy, they are both on the top. And then this went via Witnesses of Jehovah, via other groups down towards the very low groups, which were homosexuals, which were the so-called work shy, the victims of the June campaign, and Jewish prisoners. A bit of a difference was that Jewish prisoners of the June campaign were arrested as Jewish prisoners and as so-called antisocials, whereas the November pogrom prisoners were actually the first prisoners ever in the concentration camp system that were arrested just because they were Jewish. The SS kind of in this early phase was aiming in give the prisoners some kind of a very strong shock to force them to do something. In the case of Jewish prisoners, it was to force them to emigrate. In the case of non-Jewish prisoners of the June campaign, it was to to go working, to behave like the Nazis wanted you to behave. For both prisoners groups, release was possible. Quite many Jewish prisoners of both campaigns were released, but also non-Jewish prisoners of the June campaign, quite some of them were released too. So this was a phase in the concentration camp time when the concentration camp imprisonment did not mean that you were expected to die there. You were expected to stay there till the end of your life. Being released was one of the options.
My ancestor, so-called asocial, and from Kelsey, so-called asocial and Jewish, would they have met in the camp? Would they have been in the same block or barrack until November? Is there a chance?
Yeah, there's a chance. Because in the beginning, there was Jewish prisoners among the prisoners from the very beginning, from the very first day, and they were always mixed up with other prisoners in the barracks. Our listeners cannot see it now, but when we look down from this Tower A, we see 3 or more semicircles of barracks. And the very first semicircle was the barracks the political and the so-called criminal prisoners were housed in. These were the best barracks. These were the barracks who were in a best shape. I read once a testimony by a Polish prisoner. It is from a later time, but still it's very stunning and very interesting because he said he was, as a Polish prisoner, he was in one of the barracks in the very back-sided semicircles. And he said he had to fetch something up from a political prisoner in the first row. And he went in there and he later described it was the same camp, and it was not. If I compare this with our barrack, our wood was raw. Here the walls were painted. The furniture were smoothened. It was all made of wood, but these barracks had an oven. It was completely different. So the quality of the barrack was different. There was more food in the first barrack rows. And there was, of course, the prisoners were sent to the better working details. And this was exactly what defined the consequences of being added to a certain prisoners group. The higher in the hierarchy you were, the better were your living conditions. So in the first and second row, the first political and so-called criminal prisoners, second row, all the other prisoners, and the barracks of the third row, the first prisoners to be housed in there, they have been empty before. The first prisoners to be housed in there were the 6,000 prisoners that were incarcerated during this June campaign. And they started to fill the barrack from the left to the right. And I followed this not further because my research is unfortunately not so much on this June campaign, but I followed it for the November campaign. The barracks go in this small camp. You have the first row, then the second row, then the third row, and you can see it from the prisoners' numbers, how the people were in the barracks. It would be worthwhile to look at it because we should have barrack numbers for a number of prisoners. So it's possible if you put all the prisoners in a row with the prisoners' numbers and look where the barracks are, you see that they, at least with these prisoners, it can be proven that the barracks were filled one after the other. And you can see who arrived on the same day. They are in the same barrack.
That would be so helpful for people who maybe don't know on their official record what barrack their relative was in, but you know by somebody else who might be a number off from you where you might have been.
What you just said helped so much because my great-grandfather was in 31, so it's the second circle. But he said, I was in a Vorzeige-block, in a special block, like with better conditions. And he's writing word by word, I don't know what this Vorzeige thing meant, what was the benefit. But now it makes sense.
Representative barrack, you would call it in English, Vorzeigebaracke. The story behind is that there were quite many visitors coming to visit Sachsenhausen. And
a display or a show.
Yeah, and this was one of the barrack that was probably always shown to visitor groups. And so it was nice furniture, nice.
Sachsenhausen has a whole exhibition on all the different visitors, international visitors who wanted to see how the model camp of Sachsenhausen could be maybe for them to base their potential camps on, or to see how everyone was treated. And so you're saying Heinrich was in a barrack that would have been a display barrack for visitors to come and see.
Okay. Wow. In those days, clicker work was still under construction, didn't produce any bricks yet, as far as I know. Heinrich was describing work like shoveling sand, cutting down trees. It doesn't sound very specialized. From the June campaign, did they pick people according to their qualification for special things, or was it just like mass production, forced labor stuff?
In this time, the goal of the SS was to give them the hardest time possible. So they were sending them off to the brickworks the first few days. Within the group of the November pogrom prisoners, I could show that prisoners, elderly men, who were forced to do this clinker job a few days and who really couldn't do it anymore, later were put to different works where they had to clean the camp here. So the interest of the SS in these early days was not to kill them, just to torture them, to humiliate them as much as possible. I don't know how the situation was with the June campaign people, but at this time, the death rate, if we look at it in the concentration camp, it is high, but it's not as high as it would get later on. As far as I know, one of the jobs the prisoners of the June campaign was to set up the barracks in the so-called small camp, which was a part of actually before the space of the SS commandment area. The SS gave up a part of it and had 18 additional barracks set up. And this would mean that you chop down the trees which were there, and then you had to lay the foundations, which means you had big pieces of wood like wooden pylons. You had to chop them in the ground, and this is where the barracks, which were delivered in ready parts, and they had to be put together, which is still a hard work because it was huge pieces. Several prisoners had to carry these and put them up. But also Klinkerwerk, the work at the brickworks at that time, the brickworks were under construction. They were being built. So they needed a lot of stones and sand and so on. And the most terrible work in the brickworks was the ships were arriving and had the sand in sacks or the stones on it. And planks were put just from the ship towards the quay. Every prisoner had to go down, 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 down in a row. And everyone had this heavy sack of sand on his shoulders, and then you had to march over this plank, which is not easy because it was bumping, and many prisoners fell down and in the water with all their load. It was kind of, some prisoners called it the roundabout, because everybody had to run down. Everybody always had to run down to the quay, go over the plank, come to the ship, get loaded, go back up, run back up and deliver the sand.
In Barrack 31, my grandfather described the block oldest, like the block leader, the guy with a red triangle, and he describes him with the N-word. I don't know if that was his name or if it was a black guy. And I really would like to know, have there been black people in the camp?
There have been black people in the camp. This is something very special. Didn't come about too often. And there is many prisoners' testimonies on this, from transports when there was one person with African roots within this transport. I wasn't aware that the first came to Sachsenhausen so early, because the most of them were either French soldiers, which came from the colonies, or were people from the former German colonies who were working for the Germans. And after the Germans lost the colonies, they had to kind of allow them to come to Germany. And these people also were later arrested. But this was later on, because the Germans were always hoping that the Nazis would bring them the colonies back. So these people who usually spoke the language from the countries Germany was wanting, but we should have looked it up. But it may be that it was his name.
I have a last question. My great-grandfather was arrested with 2 other guys from his surrounding, and my great-grandfather survived after being here for like 7 months. The other ones were transferred to Mauthausen and died. Why did my great-grandfather survive? He became very sick in December 38. They brought him to the infirmary. He got massages, radiation therapy, whatever radiation therapy. He got medication, digitalis. They injected him tuberculin, and he was released with open tuberculosis. Why did they release him? Why did he survive?
This is a big question. I would have to look into the files to see in which connection this different treatments could have taken place. There's one thing that this camp infirmary offered treatment, especially in these early times. This was treatment which was quite a normal treatment you would also use outside the camp. Medical experiments were very common in the time after the Germans started the war, but there is not much known that this took place beforehand. As far as I know, tuberculin was something Robert Koch invented. Today it's used as a test to show whether somebody had been in contact with tuberculosis once in his life. Back then, Koch wanted to use it as a kind of vaccination against. But by that time, everybody knew that if you vaccinate people with tuberculin, you give them tuberculosis. So it doesn't really make sense. I could only guess whether somebody survived or not is sometimes simply luck. Or he was in the infirmary while his 2 comrades were taken to Mauthausen on the list. So he was not in the barrack and couldn't be added to the list. This would be a possibility. Another possibility sometimes is that there were prisoners typing these lists, and when they recognized the name of a prisoner they knew, and who was working here in this Schreibstube, in this prisoner's registration office, as a prisoner, knew that Mauthausen was a far worse camp than Sachsenhausen was, and that it is never good to be transferred there. So if I know a prisoner and I owe him a favor or I just like him, I cross him off the list. This is always a possibility. I just came across a Jewish prisoner who survived in Sachsenhausen camp from summer 1939 till the liberation. And the reason is that always in the moment when the big campaigns against Jewish prisoners were, he was either in the infirmary or they put him to Frankfurt Main, where they were preparing a court case against him. And he was in the Frankfurt Main prison in order to be presented to court. He was just lucky. This was just luck. He was not to be grabbed in the right moment, and so he survived. And when the big number of summer 1944, many Jews were again brought to Sachsenhausen. The camp, which was free of all Jews, suddenly was filled with Jewish prisoners from Auschwitz, from Stutthof-Groß-Rosen. And then he was one among others, and he survived. So this is hard to tell, but it would be interesting to look into these files, what might have happened there. In the camp infirmary is always the situation that there is SS doctors working, and these SS doctors who worked in the camp were not really the best and best educated and long experienced doctors, but usually doctors who were SS members and who were put there in order to get the first experiences in order to later be used as military doctors for the Waffen-SS. Maybe he had tuberculosis and then the guy let's try with this tuberculin, and it made it even worse. We can only guess.
You mentioned the kinds of work and labor in that time, those earlier years. Were the prisoners who were brought in during the November pogrom put to the same kind of work?
Yeah.
Same kind of work.
The barracks were already existing. It was that everybody went to the brickworks first. And the second thing was that there was construction at the Eike Villa, also in town where the SS settlements were. So these 3 different possibilities of working, and this was all very hard physical labor. And then for prisoners who just couldn't stand it or couldn't do it anymore, There was also work that they had to clean the camp, things like this. So, but it was the very same treatment.
My ancestor was only here for about 5.5 weeks.
Mhm.
Why was he released after that short amount of time?
He was released because, and this is actually the same against Jewish prisoners who were arrested in the June campaign. The aim was to force these people to leave the country. There has been Jewish emigration from 1933 on. In the taste of the Nazis, it was going too slow. And so in the summer of 1938, a first campaign was run against Jewish citizens that were less better off. In many cases, there's always people among the victims who don't belong in the group, who were arrested accidentally or for other reasons. But mainly these were people who had lost everything due to the anti-Semitic boycott, or who became unemployed because they were fired from their jobs, who couldn't work anymore, like many doctors who lost their doctor's license, things like this. And these people were arrested first. It was taught to them, if you leave the country, then we will release you. And so many of them, especially from this first phase, went to Shanghai because they usually hadn't applied for US visa in time. They didn't have a right job to go to the United Kingdom, and they didn't have the money to go to South America. So where could you go? It was mainly Shanghai. And then the same campaign in the November was run against people who were better off, who still had like assets or still had like houses or businesses, properties. And by putting them in the concentration camp, there was a high pressure put on the wives at home to sell everything. And when you sell a house in a very short time, you never get a proper price. And this was exactly the aim which was behind it. And this was prepared in April 1938. It was not a law, it was an erlass, I don't know how you say it. It's a regulation that every Jewish German had to list up detailed everything he owned. And this really went down to the last silver spoon.
I remember looking up my family, that many of the brothers and sisters had to do this for their home, their assets.
Yeah. And so the state knew what the people have, and many November pogrom prisoners were very deliberately and specifically arrested. The Gestapo came to their houses. They knew this is a person we would like to leave the country, because this is a person, when the person leaves, the state will benefit a lot with their properties. And so these people were arrested. And this is something that hadn't been known for quite a while. It is a book by Kim Wünschmann. It's in English, and it's a very good book. It's called Before Auschwitz. And it's on the persecution against Jewish people in Germany before the war was started. She proves for the first time that the group of the Jewish victims of this June campaign was statistically relevant, more often released than all the others. So their treatment was different, and they were arrested more easy. There were regulations given how somebody would get into this campaign. And for Germans, it was if you had previous convictions, you had to have 3 previous convictions. When you were Jewish, 1 previous conviction would be enough. Still, it was already the aim to force these people out of the country, even if it was not practiced to this extent as with the later November pogrom prisoners, where it was very much in the interest of the German state to get them out, have them, their valuables sold, their properties sold, and then leave the country.
It's really helpful to have this kind of dialogue with you with the memorial. I think this is a great example of the reason why this podcast is possible, why this descendant community is possible, and the knowledge that we have is from the willingness of you and the memorial to share what you know with us and to make it so specific to each of our stories so that we have a better understanding than what we could find out on our own.
Yeah, it always depends on. I don't know that much about every prisoner.
It's hard to be an expert. Over 200,000 prisoners have come here.
Yeah.
It's hard to know every one person's story.
No, I have been working about the November pogrom prisoners for years, and our database isn't too good. What I always wanted to do is to also add at least the Jewish prisoners of the June campaign to my database. And with this, I have recorded which number, whenever I have an information, I put it in there. And in some cases, I see the Entlassungsschein, the release document, and then I know when did the person come. So I add the day. And so I can see that this one is at the 9th and this is on the 10th. So all in between must be in this range. In the end, it was families that brought me to the idea with this project. I have been working about medical crimes beforehand, mainly, and I got aware that more and more second, third, and fourth generation people from November pogrom prisoners actually come. And then I got aware that these are the only people who survived, because mainly if you were a Jewish prisoner, after the beginning of the war, your chance to survive was very small. But there was a group of 6,300 men that were arrested after the November pogrom, brought to Sachsenhausen, and more than 2,000 of them still didn't make it. More than 2,000 of them did not emigrate or emigrated to unsecure countries like the Netherlands, France, Czechoslovakia, and were later deported from there, or too old. Statistically, you can show it's a question of age. Mainly, old people say, why should I go somewhere else? They sent their children abroad, and they gave take the Shabbat candle holders, please, you go. And there's terrible stories behind it. And I collected a lot of stories of relatives that came here, and I had announced in newspapers, and I was actually advised to also try to use this podcast here. So if there is somebody who has stories, the memorial, and other descendants, we are interested in every piece of information. So if you have a story to share, please get in contact. This is something that is not just for research. What I like about my job is that it's not just scientifically or administrative, this I don't like so much, but it's the humanitarian aspect. I already had it when I was doing mainly on the medical crimes, that I tried to find out, and in many cases was successful, what kind of medical experiments were done to the people. And I could tell the survivors, this is what you have to tell your doctor. This is what took place. And for them it was so important, not just in a medical sense, but to regain the power over their lives. Because as a victim of medical experiments, you are so helpless, and somebody does something, gives you injections, you don't know what it is. It is so terrible. And just by knowing, it is your life and your strength again. This is why I always like to get in contact and give this knowledge that I gain here back to the families. I do it in your case, I do it in many other cases. And I like to have families telling me the story. This has always been a motor of my work. I don't do it for science. I do it also for the people.
So you've been speaking with Descendants as part of your work for a long time. It didn't start with this Descendants project that included us, but it was kind of an extension. So why is the work with Descendants specifically so important?
What has been done in memorials for many, many years, that stories were put on display as if they were free to use for everybody. This is a life, a story, there is a family. And if I imagine the situation, you come here and you don't know anything about your forefather, you go step in one of our exhibitions and you suddenly see his biography written by people you don't know. This would be terrible. So I think it's a right to be involved, to know about it and to take part in it. And the best possible way is, like in your case, you do it yourself. And I started this with a exhibition about the November pogrom prisoners, where I had the families telling their stories. And then we made a project here about the Sinti and Roma, this intervention project, where an exhibition was existing, but people from the community were allowed to go in there and had the right to correct everything or blacken out everything they didn't want to read there and add things that were missing. And this is now the third project in this row, and it's turned out wonderful. And I love your engagement, your fantasy, your wonderful collaboration. Not every group would have done it like you did it.
Well, thank you. And it helps feel like alive today, like going to see the exhibit here at Sachsenhausen on the Roma and Sinti prisoners from here. It feels so contemporary because it's their voice on top of the exhibit. I'm wondering, when you're talking with descendants now and it's 80 years after the liberation, what kind of new information do you find when you're talking with descendants? How does that inform your work?
Sons and daughters of the former prisoners often know a lot because they were not alive yet. They were not on earth yet when their fathers were taken to the concentration camp, but even grandchildren. But they grew up in families where the story, where the family narration is vivid and it's passed on, then everybody knows about it. There's sometimes different versions. I also had interviews made where a mother and a daughter sitting and they argue about, no, it was this way, no, it was that way. So it is a living process. Your group now, some of you had hardly any information. And so I found it very interesting to see the process, how you really yourself go out to the archives and find the information out. You were not given the information, you worked for it. I wouldn't know the English word for it.
Self-initiated, maybe, or self-driven. The other thing that I found really helpful in this whole experience is getting to meet and share information with other descendants so that, for example, Jakob's relative and my relative came almost the same time to the camp, and Hilger and Insa also had a relative came in the same few days, and so we could share information about what happened during that time that we would never have known. I wouldn't have been able to look up that information because it's not my record. And so for us to be able to connect and be a part of that community was a big deal, that the memorial helped the community come together. And I'm curious, like, what you see that like in the future, or what are the possibilities for, given like kind of the law about you can't just disclose everybody's information to each other. What do you think are good ways for the descendant community to be able to connect and share that information?
We are going to renew all our exhibitions the moment the German state will give us the money, but one after the other. And we have been sitting in a group from many departments of the memorial, very different people, from the educational department, from the archives, and we've been talking, how do we want our exhibitions to be in the future? And we want them less overwhelming, but we want to have more perspectives. We just don't want this. There is not just one perspective, the historian, the German-born and German-educated historian, but we want more perspectives. Perspectives from descendants, perspectives from different ethnic groups, more perspectives offered on the sites on what happened here, because this also offers interesting insights for more visitors who have different perspectives themselves. So this is something we would like.
I can imagine even that it means like if you had perspectives from the community, like in the tower at the very top of the pyramids that has just the voices of people who lived nearby talking about what they saw from the camp from their windows. It's in their voice and you hear it. And you can look through the tower and see what they're talking about while you're hearing them on the video. And that kind of perspective makes it so much more activated, and it's not just a single voice of authority. So that is really helpful.
Yeah.
Today you opened an exhibit. We opened an exhibit that offered, we all together, including you and the team here, that offered some of that perspective. I know that that's part of what you were trying to do, is bringing in some new perspectives. What do you hope that visitors, both descendants and non-descendants, will get from that new exhibit, the exhibit that's being told from the voices of descendants?
I think it's encouragement a bit. Also, people who come in and who are not people who are descent from victims, but they see that there is room for many stories in here. This is always a difficult topic, but how to get up with a grandfather who was a perpetrator. This must be carefully chosen, but it can also offer insights in a story which are not given when you have one teacher-like white male historian who tells you how the things went here. Also, this design of the exhibition, which is modern and colorful. Actually, the exhibition designer in the beginning didn't want to choose this colors because he said, this is a former concentration camp. Everything has to be gray. And he said, no, we want it different. I hope that it addresses more parts of the society, not just middle-aged, German-speaking, well-educated, but people from all over the world.
I have one last question, which is, what do you see as the future of the memorial's work with descendants? How do you see that going or continuing or changing in the future?
I see with your project that you're really gaining strength and self-secureness in this work. What I hope is that the descendants come and said, we want this to be done like this, or we want to take part in this, and we would like to design this part of the exhibition. So it is our story that you engage with the memorial and also help us and collaborate with us when we do the new permanent exhibitions.
It's really helpful to be able to share that on this podcast so that anyone listening knows that even if we haven't met them, you haven't met them yet, that they're welcome to be a part of the conversation.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Descendant Stuff podcast is produced by Jakob Feistauer, Kelsey Snook, and Nicole Wines, 3 descendants of Sachsenhausen prisoners and co-creators of the Sachsenhausen Stuff project. The Descendant Stuff team would like to extend a special thank you to the team at Sachsenhausen Memorial and Museum, especially Dr. Astrid Ley and the members of the Educational Department's project, What Voice Do We Have?, as well as the Descendants Collective Voices of the Next Generation. The theme song, Heil Sachsenhausen, was written by Alexander Kulisiewicz while he was imprisoned at Sachsenhausen and performed by him after the war. It is used with permission from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Kulisiewicz collection. If you are a Sachsenhausen descendant who would like to share your story, please contact us through our website at www.sachsenhausen-stuff.com or use the Contact Us link in the show notes below.
Heil Sachsenhausen. A jak będę jutro wzdychał lewą nóżką, ci zawtikam. Heil, es lebe Gold, o Kampf.